Okay, this will be our third and final video on the Nazi state, Nazi Germany before World War II. I did talk about this slide some already, so I will go ahead and click through it. I talked about Goebbels and Goering, and a little bit about the Gestapo, which was the secret state police, Geheimnis Staatspolizei. Heinrich Himmler, in many ways, it could have been argued he was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, although that's debatable. Goering was very powerful. I think he technically was the second, Hitler's second, if you want to call it that. But because Heinrich Himmler controlled the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and after 1936, the SS became the most powerful organization because it controlled not just the secret state police, but also the criminal police. So all the police forces in Germany were under the auspices of the SS from that time on. And the SS later also had its own military divisions that Heinrich Himmler also had a great authority over. It would be the SS later that would control much of the, or they did actually in the 1930s control concentration camps. Concentration camps in the 1930s were certainly not as large as they would be later. They were essentially prison camps for political prisoners and groups. They became much more significant, obviously, once the war got going. And later, we'll talk about the Holocaust too. And there were other camps that were specifically death camps that had to do with the Holocaust. So concentration camps and death camps weren't necessarily the same thing. But I'll talk more about that later. So here's a pretty well-known quote from Goebbels. If you watch the video, I've showed you little clips in the last couple of videos, but watch the video on the master race. It talks of Goebbels. There's some footage of Goebbels talking about propaganda. And propaganda, the idea of propaganda was very important in the early 20th century. We tend to use the term propaganda as only a negative idea, like that it's always false, that it's just trying to create a narrative or a message, and that's partially true. But propaganda, simply put, was just the message that was being put out by the government or by a political party or any organization. It could be true, it could be false. It doesn't matter, but that's what propaganda was. And this quote is very telling. The radio became very important in Nazi Germany. In that video, the Master Race talks about this. Radios were sold very cheaply, and everyone could get one. And that was the primary means of communication. And Goebbels' department oversaw everything that went on the radio. So, yeah, there was not freedom of expression. It was highly censored and controlled. The message was controlled. And it was very important message. Also theaters, movie theaters in the 1930s. Television was not really a thing yet anywhere. But the radio, movie theaters, the Nazis were very almost obsessed about film. So that was very important to them. They really anticipated, Hitler did in his campaigning, and Goebbels did, and others that worked with them, anticipating the use of modern technology for getting your ideas across. Propaganda, right? Okay. Here's Goering. We talked about him already. As I said, he really became Hitler's number two. He was a war hero in World War I. He was a fighter ace, much like the Red Baron. He did get addicted to morphine from a wound he got. I can't remember what the wound was, but so he always had that problem later. It's interesting. He survives the war as he's the highest ranking Nazi official to be tried at the war crimes in 1946 at Nuremberg. Now, what about women in the Nazi Germany? The Nazi ideal the myth that was put forth was very traditionalist. It would sound quite conservative, quite kind of 19th century domestic sphere. Women are to raise children and to take care of the home and hearth and all that. And you can see that in that picture that I have. That's actually a campaign poster for supporting charity for women and children. But look at the idyllic picture in the back. They always have these idyllic pictures. You know, a woman nursing a baby, right? So women were to be in the Nazi ideal, anyway, that was put forth was women were to be in the domestic sphere. They were to be mothers and raise children, right? And support their husbands and so forth. Now, it didn't mean women didn't work outside the home. Many did. In fact, women working outside the home increased during the Nazi period, or at least women's employment overall increased. There might be different reasons for that, but that did happen. These were kind of traditionally accepted women's roles in European life and in the world at the time. Doesn't make them extremely exceptional in that sense, but yes, just so you know, the Nazi ideal tended to emphasize division between the male and female spheres, and women were to be teachers, caregivers, doing things like that I mentioned there. But women were also told, and we're talking about German women here, right? German women, and from the Nazi perspective, ethnic Aryan German women, were told that they were the guardians of German culture, that it was their job to preserve German culture, and they were to pass it on to their children, okay? And remember, for the Nazis, you can never have culture without race. Those two things are inseparable. Remember, for the Nazis, race is for the Nazis what economic class is for the communists, okay? So you cannot have culture, true German culture, according to the Nazis, without preserving the race. So these two things always go together. So a German woman is expected to only breed or marry a German man, right? And that was very important. That film, again, The Master Race, talks about some of these issues too. And according to this Nazi ideal, unfit women should not breed. Okay, they practiced a form of eugenics, which is a word for good genes or good breeding. Excuse me. And what this meant was there would be women who were sterilized. The Nazis did practice sterilization of people with various mental illnesses, genetic defects, people who had Down syndrome, obviously, was one of those things. And that was practiced in other places too, by the way. Less obvious genetic defects of something like Down syndrome were also treated. Now, also unfit women could be considered unfit races. They were not interested, of course, in the Jews breeding, and they discouraged the other racial groups like Slavic peoples or others later when they controlled those areas, okay? Now, just like with everything else in the Nazi world, everybody had their own organization. The National Socialist Women's Organization was the women's organization that if you wanted to be somebody, you belonged to. That's we're going to talk about more about this in a second. But everything in the Nazi world, everybody has a club or group to belong to that's related to the Nazi way of life. And there, the National Socialist Women's Organization, you have right there different outfits. So on your left, you have more of your brown shirt SA outfit, and going across, you have kind of more your black and white SS style outfit. Just a very well-known image. You can see Hitler there in his brown shirt uniform saluting SS soldiers as they march, and that's Heinrich Himmler standing below him. So the SS wore the black outfits. Here is Hitler with the so-called blood flag. This is a fascinating thing. The Nazis had this flag that went back to 1923, and it was said that the blood of some of the men who were killed in the Nazi push that we talked about before, in 1923 in Munich, their blood got on this flag. And when they created new standards or flags, or these standards they carry with the swastika there you see, or the images there, Hitler would come around and touch it with this blood flag. It was like this kind of quasi-religious act of pseudo-consecration that they did. So now let's talk about the totalitarian society. The term totalitarian, I think it was coined by Hannah Arendt, a writer in the 20th century. She might not have coined the term, but she certainly used that term and promoted the idea. So Hannah Arendt. The totalitarian society, it's what does the word totalitarian mean? It means that total, all of every facet of the individual's life is somehow fits into the bigger collective of the state and the group. Okay? So that's what she meant by the totalitarian society. How do you accomplish this? Well, you do it through mass communication, as we talked about with the radio, with the newspapers, through schools. Everything is geared towards promoting this, on one side of the quote positive message, which is the German people are great, we're all one big collective group of Germans. You have rallies, and you can see the picture there. I mean, people always like rallies and fun things like that to focus together, but the Nazis really perfected the political rally. Again, using this more strongly than really anybody had up until their time, at least in the modern period. And lastly, if the positives don't work, in quotes, you use terror to intimidate people. So that's why you have the police force. That's why you have people telling each other about certain things. Interrogations, intimidation, all these things. Now, you also need an ideology. Every totalitarian society must have an ideology, right? Something that the society revolves around. And of course, for the Nazis, it was a racial ideology. The idea that German Aryan peoples, white Northern Europeans, were the master race, and that they were creating basically this almost utopian type society over time for these people. You also have to have enemies in a totalitarian society. And for the Nazis, the primary enemies were two groups. The Jews, who were the biggest threat in their mind to racial purity, and therefore to culture and that Germanic utopia I just mentioned, and to the communists. And they often conflated these two groups. Karl Marx, of course, Jewish ancestry, right? And this becomes very important later. Now, the Nazis really played up their anti-communist side in the 1930s. They were certainly anti-Semitic too, and they passed laws and implemented specific things against Jews in Germany. They really played up publicly their anti-communist side, particularly because that appealed to a lot more people. And as I said before, in the totalitarian society, there's a group for everybody to join. Now, there's no competing groups. There might be some competing groups within the party, but everybody's supposed to have the same goal within the party. So there's no other political parties, right? Everything else, there's a word in German, Gleichschaltung. It means this idea called, you don't need to know that word, but it means to bring everything into line. So everything in society, in theory, was to be brought into line. And that included churches. It included civic organizations, everything. So you had these groups for kids, the Hitler Youth, which was for young men, boys, and adolescents. It was kind of like a souped-up version of the Boy Scouts, or kids, young men going out and doing all kinds of fun things in the woods, including, if they were old enough, learning how to shoot guns and other things like that. There were women's group, as I mentioned. There were also the young women's group, the Deutsche Mädchen, the German Girls Society. There were Nazi Labor Front. The Nazi Labor Front there were no more labor unions, right? But the labor men who worked, or women who worked, in certain types of businesses joined the Labor Front group. And that video, again, talks about some of these things. Here's Himmler reviewing some SS troops again. Always seemed like a soundly unimpressive human being to me. And that is the end of our lecture.